All right, hello, this is Michelle Kern, and today we're going to go over some basic clay terms while we are also looking at how to make slip. Slip is your clay glue that you're going to use in practically every project we work on, and you should absolutely have slip made before you dive in and start your projects. This is the material you're going to need to attach pieces of your projects together. Any kind of little decorations you want to attach to your pieces, they're all going to need to be attached with slip. So what happens if you try to stick your pieces together without using any slip? The clay will seem as though it is sticking together because it will have moisture that causes the clay pieces to adhere to each other, but it won't actually bond. And so as your project dries, you will see that bond disappear, and your clay pieces can often very much fall apart or crack in the seams. So you want to make sure that you reinforce things with slip. So you want to make sure you have a nice empty container. There's a couple containers you can use. I prefer one with a lid. It keeps your slip from drying out. And I really love these Talenti ice cream containers. They have nice big threads, a good wide mouth on the jar there. And I have had slip sitting in my little studio space here since March that is still as fresh as when I left it last time I opened it. You can also use salsa containers. Though in this one I just took the lid off a couple minutes ago, and this one is dry, so we'll use that as another example on how to revive your slip if it dries out. Larger containers like yogurt containers. If you want to make a lot of slip, just make sure it has a lid. Okay, so first what you want to do is get out the clay that you are going to be using, and in this class we're generally going to be using a clay brand called Soldate. Okay, just go ahead and open it up. You want to make sure when you're not using your clay, as in you have already cut a piece of clay off of there, go ahead and always make sure that you wrap your clay up, save your little twist tie, and make sure that you don't leave your bag of clay just sitting open like this, because what will happen is the air will start drying your clay immediately, and it's just kind of hard to revive. So make sure that you keep it as revived as possible. If it does seem to harden up a little bit, you can, if you've got a driveway or a good sidewalk outside where you live, you can go and kind of whack it like 4 or 5 times in the bag on the sidewalk and loosen up the particles. If it still seems like it's dry and hard to use, you may have to take a cup of water and just kind of dump it in there and close your bag for a while and see if it sucks the moisture back in. Okay? So once clay starts drying, it can be really difficult to re-moisten. So that's why we want to make sure it stays pretty moist. Okay, so I am going to take just a few chunks of clay off of here. And we're not doing anything very tidy, so we're just going to make some little chips for slip. So I'm going to just take about 4 or 5 pieces. Okay. Go ahead, take our bag. Okay, close that back up. Okay. So if you have a nice sunny area to work outside or keep things, that would be a good way to do this quickly. If you don't, you can just take the little pieces of clay, and we want the clay to dry out. So whatever method you use, you just let it air dry inside of your home, or you put it outside. You want to make sure that you make these pieces pretty thin. So the thinner that the clay is, the quicker it's going to dry, because it's going to have less density for the air to move around it or through it. Okay, so I'm taking little pieces of clay here. I'm just pinching them down pretty much to the kind of thinness of potato chips. We won't generally work with structures that have slabs this thin, because even though they dry quickly and they can be easy and fun to work with, when clay is this thin, it doesn't have enough integrity to really hold weight. So if I were to take a little piece of clay like this, I wanted to put a big piece of clay on it like this, it doesn't hold the weight, and it can also bend the structure underneath. So kind of the first few lessons we're going to do in this class are going to kind of teach you the way the clay behaves when you try to build a structure. Okay, so go ahead. Okay, so I have never tried to dry these out using a toaster oven or an oven with a baking sheet. I imagine you could do that if you wanted to work quickly. The thing with clay is that it does have moisture inside, more so than what we generally cook. So what can happen with clay is if you heat it up very quickly, steam will form and escape very quickly, and that can cause clay to explode, and it is a big mess if you've got a lot of little clay shards. So I suggest if you do want to experiment and heat clay up to dry it quickly, I would not do that for any of your projects, because that can put a strain on your projects. But if you're doing a little something like this, or a little piece that you want to get a little further along, I would recommend keeping your oven on pretty low heat. At about 500, steam is going to form very quickly, and that's when you can get the cracks or explosions happening. But if you preheat it to about 250 and let the clay kind of warm up in there slowly, I bet you could probably get away with getting these bone dry pretty quickly. Okay. Otherwise, you can just do natural heat outside and sit them out in the sun. I don't really have a yard, so we're gonna come back when mine are dry. Okay, so we want to get enough of these that we have enough to do probably about half the jar, this Talenti jar that I'm going to use. Okay. So when clay is at this point, it's just fresh clay. And as it dries, it's going to go into a halfway point where it firms up and gets some more integrity. And that is when clay is called leather hard. And leather hard has kind of a range of integrity from just about dry, and it's kind of the firmness of maybe a sharp cheddar, to almost all the way dry, where it's like a brittle piece of stale toast. And you can do or not do things depending on where it is in that stage of dryness. So it's always important, just like with your bag of clay, that you keep your projects wrapped and moist in between sessions working on them. Because if your clay gets almost all the way through leather hard to the point where it starts to dry, where we start to call it greenware or bone dry, it is really difficult to stick fresh, wet clay onto dry clay. That is because clay, it shrinks, for one, and two, it's really hard to get the slip to bond to dry clay. So what'll happen is that the top part, or the fresh part that you attach to the dry part, will start shrinking at a different rate than the first section that you did that's already too dry, and then they'll separate from each other. It's really frustrating. It's just better if you keep like a nice thin produce bag, if you have dry cleaning bags, thin waste bin liners. Those are all really good to keep your projects wrapped up. Okay, so I've got all of my chips pressed out here. Okay, so while we're waiting for this to dry, you can look at this bucket of slip here. It's just probably leather hard now, so this isn't really going to be useful for slip. And a lot of people make the mistake, they come in and they're like, oh, I have this dried out slip. They go ahead and pour water on there. Well, what can happen is when it gets to this state, the clay will no longer really absorb any water, and so the clay or the water will just sit on the surface of this drying bucket of leather hard clay in here. So what I'm going to do is just let this sit out, and I'm going to let this dry all the way. When it gets to the state that's called bone dry, it's going to be chalky and dry. When I go ahead and pour water on there, it's not going to have any moisture, residual moisture left in the clay, and so it's just going to suck that water in right away. Okay, and then we'll revive it. I'll show you that. Okay, so in terms of slip thickness, I actually prefer to have the slip be a little thicker, so that's why I've put out a lot of chips here, and that way I can adjust. If my slip seems a little thin, I can add some more clay in there. It's like adding some flour to dough. The more clay you add to a watery mixture of slip, while everything's bone dry, it'll suck in more clay and it'll make it thicker. Okay, so you can see the density of my slip here. It's pretty kind of like a really gummy frosting. Okay, and you'll notice as we go on in this course that I use food similes and metaphors for practically everything, so just get used to that. So the reason why you don't want to do slip that's too thin is that in the early stages of your clay, when your clay is really wet, so it's fresh like this, you're putting slip on there. If you've got a lot of water in your slip, it can cause the clay to become oversaturated and make this even more, it gets like jello, and it just makes it harder and harder to make your pieces have enough structure to attach to each other. So that's just something you want to watch out for. Sometimes I've seen people, they're like smearing this watery slip all over their project and it's starting to collapse, and it's kind of like an oversaturated ground when it rains too much and you start to get mudslides. Clay starts to do a little bit of that, so it loses its integrity. So for right now, I'm going to take a break. We're going to let our chips dry here. We are waiting for them to go through the leather hard stage, so I'll come back when they get to that stage and we'll look at what that looks like. And then when they get to bone dry, I will come back and I'll show you how to mix slip. Okay, thank you so much.